Happy New Year, everyone. This is Kumar and Glenn Marshall again, and we're going to be talking all about XSCALE. And in this episode, we're going to be covering permaculture principles 7 and 8. Glenn, I hope you had a wonderful holiday. And what did you do for your Christmas break?
It was a staycation, but I was away from work, so that was a good break.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, same here. I had a bunch of things to catch up on, so stayed at home. So if you have been watching this series, we've been following the permaculture principles and comparing them to XSCALE's ecosystem thinking principles, which these principles from XSCALE are really inspired by, I should say, the permaculture principles. And so we're up to principle 7, the 7th permaculture principle, and of course the 7th ecosystem principle. So I'll just read what the 7th permaculture principle is. Let me just scroll down here because I don't remember it off the top of my head. And it is design from patterns to details. And so what it inspired with Peter Marilyn and his merry band of ecosystem thinking coaches is this principle: design breadth first. And so maybe we can start by just describing, at least as much as our time allows, we're not going to get into a very deep discussion, but what does it mean to design from patterns to details from a permaculture perspective? You want to take a stab at that, Glenn?
From a permaculture perspective, the analogy that they use is that of a spider web. The spider doesn't start in the inside; the spider starts on the outside, looks for things to connect it to, and looks at the big picture. Looks at the other example that they talk about is the forest versus the trees. So you do need to take a step back and sort of survey the landscape, see what you have to work with, and then build with that in mind. And I don't want to jump ahead too much, but the connections to organizations are very powerful. So this is a deeply resonant principle, at least for me.
Yeah, I agree. It is very resonant and certainly does apply to organizational structures. We don't really think about designing organizations this way. They're sort of built haphazardly. And then actually, really, permaculture is an attempt to move away from how we design farms, because farms are also, traditional farms are designed haphazardly. It's just, okay, let's plant this crop here and plant that crop there. And, we can rotate crops once every year or 2 years or whatever. And what that ends up doing is, of course, degrading the soil, the ground, and so then we have to pump a bunch of fertilizers into the ground to build it back up. It may even cause erosion of the topsoil layer, which then we have to bring more topsoil in and build that back up so that it can sustain the next yield. Remember, sustaining a yield was one of the permaculture principles, right? And so from a permaculture perspective, it's taking a broader view of how plants and the ecosystem that supports the growth of these plants, how they interrelate, and how the ecosystem supports the growth of various crops, and how various crops can be planted together to enhance the yield of each and also sustain the soil that gives them life. And so, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think traditional farming, with its focus on optimization, doesn't even get into crop rotation. Just plant a single crop, throw on fertilizer to replace the nutrients, and just keep doing it again and again. And of course, the soil depletes over time. Rotation is kind of a permaculture principle.
You're right. You're absolutely right. I remember driving through the breadbasket of the U.S., in Napa Valley, not Napa Valley, but sort of the valley there between San Francisco and Los Angeles, where they grow all kinds of fruits and vegetables and, just acres and acres, miles and miles of orchards, right? And I always wonder, what do they have to do to keep these fruits from these trees that continue bearing fruit, season after season after season? And what happens when they reach their end of life? They probably just, cut them all down and plant new trees. Right? There is no real rotation there. And so I'm sure it affects their yields.
California is actually a good example of this. There's a serious water shortage there, but the farms have been allocated huge percentages of the water that's available, and they're kind of cavalier about it. They're growing water intensive crops because they're not thinking like an ecosystem.
Sustainable farming, thinking about the ecosystem as a whole, thinking more at the big picture, the patterns, the boundaries, the inputs and the outputs of the system when designing a farm, or designing a farm and how it coexists with the community that depends on it, right? And there are very strong parallels when designing. So maybe we can kind of switch and move in that direction.
And this is a concern that I have with many of the organizations that I've worked in, that they're not really designed to respond to the markets and to the ecosystem and environment in which they work. They tend to be hierarchical and structured and not really thinking about, working together and looking at synergies between markets. Peter talks about the gaps between markets. Where can we expand? We're in one market. Where can we grow out laterally and expand and lever what we already have established? So this is something that I think a lot of organizations don't consider, to their great detriment. There's capacity there that is not being used.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And ecosystem thinking principle, to your point, is really about stepping back to see patterns in and between markets and in and between business streams. So what he means here is, of course, it's easy to understand the patterns between markets. So markets that either consume or produce goods, services that are consumed or produced by some other market. So there's a relationship there. So being able to see those patterns. Good example would be, I know you like to talk about Apple, but the whole ecosystem around Apple and all the different products that they produce, they don't build everything from scratch by themselves. I mean, they have a huge ecosystem that basically exists only because of Apple, right? There's so many companies out there that exist to serve Apple, and of course they've diversified since then. The companies that make the chips, and the companies that make the software, and the companies that make the games that millions of people play on their iPhones, and so on and so forth. This whole ecosystem exists because of how Apple designed it. They designed their ecosystem in a way such that they would be able to derive mutual benefit from their partner, whether they're explicit partners or implicit, because they serve some niche in the marketplace that Apple created.
I think it's fascinating to drill down even deeper than that. Think about how Apple started. It's going back a couple of years now, and a number of years, but they started with iTunes. Then they brought out the iPod, then they brought out the iPhone, but each built on each other.
Yeah.
So this is a great example of applying this in between markets notion. And a more modern example is Tesla. Tesla bringing out the cars, with the electric cars, which the biggest component of which is certainly by cost is the batteries. But now they've got the batteries down, they're going and leveraging that and making energy systems. They claim that the energy systems is going to be bigger than the automotive business, which kind of boggles my mind. But this is reusing and finding an adjacent market.
Right. And certainly their supercharger network was a closed ecosystem as recently as 6 months ago, 8 months ago, but now it has been opened up. Right, other manufacturers are going to be able to use the Tesla supercharger network, and so it's again looking at patterns between markets and business streams. So Fords will be able to charge their cars at the Tesla supercharger station. Chevys will, and Hyundai's will. I think Hyundai is signed on. Certainly Volvo did, and all these other companies are doing it. Of course, to the detriment maybe of the Tesla owners, me being one of them. I don't want these other cars taking my spot at the Tesla supercharger station.
Well, it's not all the superchargers. They're only opening up a percentage of them. But again, showing synergy. Now the government is giving Tesla money to go and open more superchargers. So again, this synergistic thing, and it's not all. But I'm confident that they'll scale this up. but it extends beyond that. It extends to the power wall and to those gigantic, I think they call them mega chargers, basically a battery in a shipping container.
Yeah.
Like, you want a power plant in a hurry,
Right.
Shipping container.
Yeah.
So, again, fabulous innovations. And another example is the self-driving.
Yeah.
That, of course, is going to be scaled up to trucks, but now it's also being scaled over to the humanoid robot. So the same software works for cars and will do other things in this completely new market for robots. So again, focused and constantly looking for these adjacent markets and gaps and things. Tesla is another example of what Apple has done.
It's a good example of how they're looking at business streams. So the business stream of the car, and then the power generation, and then of course the robot, the self-driving, the superchargers. These are all different business streams, but they're looking at how to synergize all these things into one, into a series. How can they benefit from each other, right? What is the mutual benefit that exists between these different business streams? And not all companies do this, or do this very well, especially as companies grow in size and become more bureaucratic.
It disturbs me that this is so rare. It's so powerful, yet it's so rare. And when you can do this, you build an ecosystem that is orders of magnitude more powerful and more profitable than just a single product line.
Right.
And you have to do it because products are constantly getting obsoleted.
That's right. So in summary, we're about 12 minutes, so we want to keep this, fairly short. Designing breadth first, or that's the ecosystem thinking principle, or the permaculture principle is design from patterns to details. It's really all about taking a systemic view of the organization and understanding the market or markets that you serve, and how can you create some synergies between them, between the business streams that are serving these markets. It's not just intra-organizational, it's extra-organizational. So meaning, how does your company, how does it interact with other companies, whether implicitly or explicitly? So
exactly.
Would you say, did I miss anything?
No, you absolutely nailed it. Tesla is a good example of being focusing this principle internally, but also externally.
Yeah, just one last point I just thought of is that they've open sourced all this stuff. I mean, it's available.
Yeah,
there's nothing is really proprietary. Even the Hyperloop stuff, which I think they use some of it to build their tunnels. The Boring Company, which I don't know where that's going, but all of that stuff has been open sourced, so anyone can sort of take advantage of it. Ready to move on to principle 8?
Let's do it.
All right, principle 8, permaculture principle 8 is integrate rather than segregate. All right, so I'll just read a couple of points, or try to explain a couple of points, and maybe you can jump in and talk a little bit more about the permaculture principle first, and then we'll dive into the ecosystem thinking and how it compares to it. So it really, the principle 8 from permaculture focuses on creating beneficial relationships between design elements, to integrate them into a self-regulating system. So it's kind of a repeat in some ways. A lot of these things they all kind of dovetail together, all these principles, right? So we kind of just said this in the last one. Hey, take a systems view. It's about figuring out what crops work together well. You don't want to design from the inside out. You want to design from the outside in. In this case, it's really about the relationships between the things that you're planting, or the systems that are going to be supporting the things that you're planting from an agricultural perspective. Mm-hmm. What would you add to that?
Again, comes back to the farms. Things are not integrated. You plunk one thing down here, or you even have a monoculture. You just have a single crop on a massive farm. But this is all about looking at the various components and making sure that they have relationships between them. Relationships, I think, is the key word in this.
Yeah. And what a good example on a farm would be free-range chickens, right? That are part of a permaculture farm. And the chickens, they aren't just free-range because people like to, eat free-range chickens because they haven't been fed soy or whatever. They also serve a purpose on the farm. because they scratch the ground and they leave their droppings, and that the act of doing that actually adds nitrogen to the soil, the fertilizer to the soil. They eat little bugs and insects and things and keep some of the pests out, and eat the pests that actually might damage the crops that are growing there. And so there's an integration of the different systems here that allow for a more vibrant and healthy farm.
I'm not sure about the animal angle, and free range chickens is kind of complicated, but definitely in terms of crops, I haven't really thought about the animals, to be perfectly honest. But even free range is kind of not really free range if you start digging into it. But the plants, I think, are powerful.
I mean, you think about it though. The chickens, if they are, allowed to feed on whatever they find, their natural diet, they're omnivorous. They'll eat anything. Worms and bugs and, of course, vegetable matter and stuff like that. And it's part of the natural ecosystem, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so why wouldn't it be a way to integrate? What's this thing called? Integrate rather than segregate. You don't want all the chickens in a chicken coop, because then they're doing no good except, eating feed that doesn't do any good to the farm.
It's true. Having true free range chickens, which most free range isn't actually free range, but having true free range chickens like a traditional farm a number of years ago, yes, I would agree with you. They tend to be fenced in, like around the barn, so they're free range, but you don't want them going on the road, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is permaculture, right? We're talking about within permaculture farming, you would see things like this where you have different systems that are integrated rather than segregated.
Yep.
Right. It's deliberate integration of animal systems and plant systems for some mutual benefit to both. I think you would see that.
And I recall reading that I think it was ducks. Some animal, I believe it was a bird, was eating some pests, and rather than use pesticides, you have a natural pesticide, not a pesticide, but a pest removal agent in an animal.
Right, exactly. And so I think that's the gist of this. So how does this apply to corporate structures?
This one, I think, is also particularly juicy. Focus on building relationships with other disciplines, other business functions, how we can work together cooperatively. It could be with the finance department, or it could be with another engineering group if you're an engineering firm. But the idea is to focus on relationships. Don't delegate, build relationships. Just like with the permaculture, the parallels are very strong here. So yeah, the critical word here, to my mind, is relationship.
Yeah, exactly. And I don't know if you remember the old Scrum adage, right? It was something about chickens and pigs. How did that go? Do you remember that?
I do.
Don't be a chicken, or don't be a pig. Be a chicken. I don't know. The chicken gets their neck wrung, the product owner, right? The pigs, they just, or was it the other way around? They just lay the eggs, and anyway.
Yeah, the pigs are more invested.
They're more invested because they produce the bacon, and so of course they have to give up their lives for that. The chickens, they just lay the eggs.
It's a bit of a harsh analogy, but
it's not a really good analogy, but it just came to mind because I was talking about chickens, and when we were talking about permaculture. So
there's a segue there.
that's how my mind works, anyway.
No, I hear you. I do that all the time.
Right. So in corporate cultures, it's about, to your point, it's about collaborating and working together, and rather than just delegating the work, it's about, hey, how can we do this? The nature of this principle in an organization, hey, how can we work on this together, rather than, hey, Glenn, can you go do this? See you later. Right.
And the typical organization structure, being hierarchical, doesn't encourage this. So this does require some creativity and some thoughtfulness in how you arrange your reward mechanisms. For example, you want to reward and encourage collaboration, which is hard.
Yeah. Well, if you look at most successful companies, I would say a good reason they're successful is because of the level of collaboration that exists between their people and their teams, right? And as companies get bigger and bigger, that gets harder to maintain, but it's so critically important that you preserve that sort of network structure within a company. When you're a small startup, it's much easier, right?
Yep.
A company of 20, it's really easy to keep track of everyone and work in more mutually beneficial relationships. But as the company grows, then it's much harder to keep things and people straight, and which is why these hierarchical structures exist in the first place. It's an attempt for some order. Would you say that's true?
And we do need order, but order shouldn't come at the expense of collaboration.
Yes.
We do, even in these networked ecosystem models, we do need to respect the discipline. Like finance is a good example. Finance has to make sure that you keep the lights on, but they can work cooperatively with other groups and other teams, and there's great benefit when they do that.
Absolutely. All right. I think we've covered it pretty well. The eighth principle again is from permaculture is integrate rather than segregate, and the eighth ecosystem principle is really, it's what's floating down at the bottom of your screen. There's more to it. It's don't delegate but collaborate. I'll read the whole thing. People and teams are in the right relationships when their conversations evolve to support each other's work and learning. I think that's a powerful statement, right? So they are in the right relationships when these things happen. So if these things don't happen, that means there's something missing in the relationship between people and teams.
And there's something else that jumped out at me when I looked that over. It's implied the notion of balance. Don't be unifocused. Look at the big picture. Have a balanced view of the various things that are going on. Don't just be unifocused.
Right. Good point. Very good point. All right. Any parting thoughts before we end this segment?
You mentioned learning as well as work, right?
Correct. Yeah.
Yeah, that's
support each other's work and learning.
Yes, I think that's
and that's come up before in some of the principles we covered earlier.
Yep.
Right. Principle 2, capture and store learning in small self-organizing teams. As these work on the current bottleneck, they become capable of opening future ones. So that's really focused on one team. This is really about taking a broader view, like this. The 7th and 8th principle is taking a broader view and looking at how are teams collaborating with each other? How do they share learning with each other? And so, just like the permaculture principles, they sort of all dovetail, build upon each other. So do the ecosystem thinking principles.
Yep. I do find it interesting how all these principles, have relationships between each other.
Yeah.
And they dovetail, but so the principles themselves are an ecosystem.
That's an interesting. You just blew my mind. The principles are an ecosystem. Interesting. So one cannot exist just by itself. Exactly. Well, it can, but I don't know how much benefit you would get from just doing one, without the others. If the other things didn't exist, it would probably wither and die, just like a single crop farm eventually will fail because the soil has been used up.
Or a single product company would get obsolete.
Yeah.
By competitors.
Yeah. Ooh, well, this is a great place to end. I mean, on a high note, my goodness, my hairs in the back of my neck are tingling.
Wow.
All right, Glenn, this has been fun. We'll see you all in a month where we'll cover principles 9 and 10. And then 2 months from now, we'll cover the last 2. And then I don't know what we're going to do. We're going to talk about something, but there's lots to talk about. So, all right. Thanks for watching. See you all later. Bye-bye.